David Richardson stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, staring at the city lights below. At 42 years old, he had everything most people dreamed of. His tech company was worth billions. He owned properties in 3 countries. Magazine covers featured his face regularly. But none of that mattered anymore. Not since the day his wife passed away. It had been 2 years since cancer took Jennifer from him and their son. 2 years of trying to hold everything together while feeling like he was drowning. David threw himself into work because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Numbers, deals, acquisitions. These things had rules. These things he could control. His 6-year-old son, Liam, was a different story. The boy who used to fill the house with laughter now barely spoke. He moved through their home like a little ghost, quiet and careful, as if afraid to take up too much space. David watched his son retreat further into himself with each passing month, and he had no idea how to reach him. The nannies came and went, 5 and 2 years. Each one came with impressive credentials and left within months, citing various reasons. Too demanding. The hours were too long. The child was too difficult. David knew the real problem was him. He micromanaged everything, left detailed instructions every morning and expected perfection. But how else was he supposed to ensure his son was cared for properly? Then Patricia Monroe from the elite staffing agency called him with a suggestion. She had someone special, she said. Someone with 30 years of experience. Someone who had worked with grieving children before. Her name was Ruth Matthews, and she was available immediately. David agreed to the interview mostly because he was desperate. He had a major deal closing in Tokyo next month and needed stability at home. When Ruth arrived at his office, he barely looked up from his computer for the first few minutes. She waited patiently, her hands folded in her lap, until he finally gave her his attention. She was in her late 50s with kind eyes and a calm presence that immediately filled the room. Her resume was impressive. She had raised children for some of New York's most prominent families. References glowed about her patience, her warmth, her dedication. But something in David hesitated. She wasn't what he expected. She wasn't what his mother would call appropriate for their social circle. His mother's voice echoed in his head from their last phone call. You need someone who understands your world, David. Someone who knows how to raise a boy in your position. He pushed the thought away, annoyed with himself for even considering it. During the interview, Ruth spoke softly but confidently. She asked questions about Liam that no other nanny had asked. What did he love before his mother died? What made him laugh? What were his fears? David found himself sharing more than he intended. He told her about how Liam used to paint with Jennifer, how they would make up silly songs together, how the house used to be filled with noise and mess and life. Ruth listened to every word. Then she said something that stuck with him. Grief in children doesn't look like grief in adults, Mr. Richardson. They don't process loss the way we do. Sometimes they need permission to be messy again, to be loud again, to feel big feelings without being afraid of them. David wasn't sure he agreed with that philosophy, but something about her made him feel like Liam would be safe. So he hired her, despite the little voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his mother's disapproval. Ruth started the following Monday. David left detailed instructions on the kitchen counter as always. Liam's schedule was precise. Breakfast at 7. Educational activities from 9 to 11. Lunch at noon. Quiet time until 2. Outdoor play for exactly 1 hour if weather permitted. Dinner at 6. Bath at 7. Bed by 8. No exceptions. He watched from the doorway that first morning as Ruth read his notes. She didn't comment on them, just nodded and smiled. Then she turned to Liam, who sat at the breakfast table pushing cereal around his bowl, and said good morning in the warmest voice David had heard in 2 years. The first week, David barely noticed any changes. He left for work before 7 and came home after 9 most nights. Ruth sent him brief updates via text. Liam ate breakfast. Liam completed his math worksheet. Liam went to the park. Everything seemed fine, which in David's world meant everything was under control. But then small things started appearing. A drawing taped to the refrigerator. Liam's shoes left by the door instead of in the closet. A stack of library books on the coffee table. David would straighten these things before bed, returning items to their proper places, maintaining order. His housekeeper, Maria, who came twice a week, mentioned that the house felt different. Lighter, she said. David didn't know what that meant and didn't have time to ask. He was preparing for the Tokyo trip and working 18-hour days. One evening, he came home at 8:30 instead of his usual time. Ruth was just putting Liam to bed. He heard her voice drifting from his son's room, reading a story with different voices for each character. Then he heard something that made him stop in the hallway. Liam was giggling. Not a big laugh, but a small, genuine sound of happiness that David hadn't heard in so long, he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. He stood there frozen, listening to his son enjoy a bedtime story, something twisted in his chest. When was the last time he had read to Liam? When was the last time he'd tucked him in? Ruth emerged from the room 10 minutes later and seemed surprised to see David standing there. They exchanged brief pleasantries. She mentioned that Liam had a good day, that he'd asked questions during their museum visit, that he'd eaten all his vegetables at dinner. David nodded, thanked her, and retreated to his home office. But that giggle stayed with him. Over the next few weeks, he noticed other changes. Liam started coming to breakfast already dressed without being reminded. He spoke in complete sentences occasionally. Once David even saw him playing with toy cars in the living room, making quiet engine sounds. David's mother visited one Sunday afternoon. Ruth was off that day, and David struggled through lunch with his son in silence while his mother critiqued everything from the menu to Liam's posture. After she left, she called David from her car. "I'm not sure about this nanny situation, David. Is she really the right fit for our family? She seems nice enough, but you know what I mean. You want Liam to be around people who can open doors for him in the future, people who understand your world." David felt irritation rise in his throat. "Ruth is excellent at her job, Mother. Liam is improving." His mother made a disapproving sound. "Well, just be careful. You know how people talk. And make sure she's not getting too comfortable." These types sometimes forget their place. David ended the call quickly, angry with his mother and uncomfortable with his own reaction. Why had her words bothered him so much? Ruth was doing exactly what he hired her to do. What did anything else matter? But the seed of doubt had been planted, even though he didn't want to admit it. He started paying more attention when he was home, watching how Ruth interacted with Liam, looking for something wrong, some reason to justify the uncomfortable feeling his mother had stirred up. He found nothing. Ruth was professional, patient, and clearly devoted to Liam's well-being. She followed his instructions mostly, though he noticed she'd adjusted the schedule slightly. Less structured academic time, more creative play. He should have said something about that, but Liam seemed happier, so he let it go. 3 months into Ruth's employment, David's business partner mentioned seeing Liam at the Children's Museum with a lovely woman. "Older lady, very attentive," he'd said. "Your new nanny?" David confirmed yes. His partner had nodded approvingly. "She seems wonderful with him." He was actually laughing. David felt a strange mix of relief and something else. Jealousy maybe, guilt? He couldn't name it. He was glad Liam was happy, but some part of him hurt that someone else was drawing out his son's laughter while he remained locked in his office, chasing deals that suddenly seemed less important. The Tokyo trip approached. David would be gone for 10 days. He left extra detailed instructions for Ruth, more money for activities, and his assistant's contact information for emergencies. Ruth assured him everything would be fine. Liam would be safe and cared for. As David boarded his flight, he pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo in his gallery. It was from that morning. Ruth had sent it. Liam was at the kitchen table, concentrating hard on drawing something, his tongue poking out slightly the way Jennifer's used to when she focused. The caption read, "Morning artist at work." David stared at that photo for a long time, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd really looked at his son. Really seen him. He'd been so busy controlling everything that he'd stopped being present for anything. He promised himself that when he returned from Tokyo, things would be different. He would be different. He would be the father Liam needed. But life has a way of derailing the best intentions, and David had no idea that everything was about to fall apart in the worst possible way. The Tokyo deal collapsed on day 3. The merger that David had spent 6 months orchestrating fell apart over a disagreement about intellectual property rights. 18-hour days of negotiations led nowhere. By day 5, everyone admitted defeat. David booked the next flight home, exhausted and frustrated. He arrived back in New York on a Thursday evening, 3 hours earlier than Ruth expected. The flight had been bumpy. His mind was spinning with the failed deal, and all he wanted was a glass of whiskey and silence. His business associate, Thomas Crawford, had caught the same flight back and insisted on sharing a car from the airport. Fine. Whatever. David was too tired to argue. They pulled up to his building just before 6 in the evening. Thomas mentioned needing to use the restroom and asked if he could come up for a minute. David agreed absently, his mind already moving through the work emails piling up on his phone. The doorman greeted them. The elevator rose smoothly to the penthouse. David unlocked his door and walked into absolute chaos. His pristine white living room looked like a tornado had hit it. Every cushion from the sofa was on the floor. Toys were scattered across the marble coffee table and expensive rug. But worse, so much worse, were the paints. Finger paints in red, blue, yellow, and green were smeared across his white leather sofa. Handprints covered the glass coffee table. Paint containers sat open on his wife's antique side table, dripping onto the wood. In the middle of this disaster sat Liam and Ruth, both covered in paint. They were laughing, actually laughing. Liam had paint in his hair, on his clothes, all over his hands. Ruth's sweater was streaked with colors, and she had a blue handprint on her cheek. They were so absorbed in whatever they were doing that they didn't even notice David and Thomas standing in the doorway. David felt something explode inside his chest. All the frustration from Tokyo, all the stress from the failed deal, all the exhaustion from the flight, it all channeled into pure fury. What on earth was happening here? This was unacceptable. This was his home, his space, the place he paid Ruth to maintain properly. Ruth! His voice cut through the room like a knife. Both Ruth and Liam jumped, their heads snapping toward him. Liam's face went from joy to fear in an instant. Ruth stood up quickly, paint dripping from her hands. "Mr. Richardson, I can explain." David's voice was getting louder. He felt Thomas shift uncomfortably beside him. "Explain what exactly? Why you've let my son destroy our home? Why there's paint all over furniture that costs more than most people make in a year? Why you're sitting on the floor like this is some kind of playground?" Ruth's expression remained calm, but David saw something flash in her eyes. Hurt maybe, or anger. It only made him more furious. She had no right to be upset. She was the one who'd created this mess. "We were working on a project," she started, her voice steady. "Liam has been doing so well with expressing himself through art. And today we had a breakthrough where he wanted to create something big and meaningful. I thought it was important to let him follow that creativity." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A breakthrough? This isn't a breakthrough. This is negligence. This is completely irresponsible. Do you have any idea what you've done? That sofa alone is worth $15,000. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll just wait in the hallway," he muttered, backing toward the door. David barely registered him leaving. His attention was fixed on Ruth and the disaster surrounding her. Liam had started crying. Quiet tears rolled down his cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the paint on his face. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I wanted to paint Mommy." Those words should have stopped David, should have made him pause and think. But his anger had momentum now, and he couldn't stop it. "Not now, Liam. Go to your room and get cleaned up. This is between me and Ruth." The boy ran from the room sobbing. David heard his bedroom door slam. Good. He could deal with Liam later. Right now he needed to address this situation with his nanny. Ruth was washing her hands on a towel, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Mr. Richardson, if you'll give me a moment to explain the therapeutic value of what we were doing today." "Therapeutic value?" David felt his face getting hot. "Don't give me that excuse. This isn't therapy. This is you being lazy and letting my son run wild. My late wife would never have allowed something like this. She kept this home beautiful and maintained, and she taught Liam proper behavior." Ruth's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, sir, your late wife also encouraged creativity and emotional expression. That's what we were doing today." Something in her tone, some hint of challenge, pushed David over an edge he didn't know he was approaching. Words started tumbling out, words he didn't plan, words that came from some ugly place inside him he didn't want to acknowledge. "You know what I think? I think you've forgotten your place here. I hired you to care for my son, not to treat my home like some kind of community center. I need someone professional, someone who understands standards, someone who respects what this family represents." Even as he said it, David knew he was crossing a line. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications he hadn't quite meant to voice but couldn't take back. Ruth's face changed. The hurt was clear now, mixed with a dignity that somehow made David feel smaller. "I see," she said quietly. "I understand what you're saying, Mr. Richardson." No, he didn't think she did, but he was too far gone to stop now. The failed Tokyo deal, the exhaustion, the shock of walking into chaos, it all fueled his anger. And beneath that anger was something else. Embarrassment. Thomas had seen this mess. Would tell other people. What would they think? That David Richardson couldn't even maintain order in his own home. "I want you to leave," David said, his voice cold now instead of hot. "Pack your things. I'll pay you through the end of the month, but I want you out of here tonight." Ruth looked toward the hallway where Liam had disappeared. "Mr. Richardson, please consider what this will do to your son. He's made so much progress. He trusts me. If you'll just let me explain what we were working on today, why it was so important." David cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want explanations. I want you gone. This is my home, my son, and my decision. You're fired." The words settled over the room like a physical weight. Ruth stood there for a long moment looking at David with an expression that would haunt him later. Disappointment. Not for herself, but for him. As if she'd expected better and he'd let her down. She nodded slowly. "I'll get my things." She walked past him toward the small room off the kitchen where she kept her belongings. David heard her moving around, opening drawers, the zip of a bag. He stood in his destroyed living room, surrounded by paint and toys and evidence of his son's happiness, and felt nothing but righteous anger. Thomas was waiting in the hallway when David stepped out. The other man looked uncomfortable. "David, maybe that was a bit harsh." She seemed like she really cared about the kid. David's jaw clenched. "You don't understand the situation, Thomas. Standards matter. Discipline matters. I can't have someone working in my home who doesn't respect that." Thomas raised his hands in surrender. "Your call, man. I should get going. Sorry about Tokyo, yeah. Tokyo. The failed deal. One more thing that hadn't gone according to plan today." David went back inside, closing the door behind him. Ruth emerged 10 minutes later with a single duffel bag. She'd washed the paint off her face and hands. She looked tired, David noticed. Older than her 58 years. She walked to the door, then paused. "Mr. Richardson, I hope someday you'll understand what happened today. What Liam was trying to tell you through that painting." He was painting his mother. "The mess you saw wasn't chaos. It was healing. It was love. It was a little boy finally able to express his grief in a healthy way for the first time in 2 years." David's hand was on the door handle. He didn't want to hear this. Didn't want her words to chip away at his certainty that he'd done the right thing. "The painting is still there if you want to look at it before you clean up," Ruth continued quietly. "Really look at it. See what your son was trying to show you." She left then, walking to the elevator with her bag. David closed the door and turned back to his ruined living room. He should check on Liam, but first he needed to see the extent of the damage. He needed to start planning how to clean this mess up. He walked closer to the sofa, looking at the paint smears with disgust. What had Ruth meant about it being a painting? It just looked like random chaos to him, handprints and smears and streaks of color going everywhere. But then he stepped back, tilted his head, and suddenly he saw it. The blue smears formed a dress. The yellow streaks were hair. The red paint created a smile. The handprints weren't random. They were carefully placed to create the outline of a woman's figure. His son had painted a portrait of Jennifer using his hands and his whole body, creating something big enough to wrap himself in. To feel surrounded by, David sank onto the ottoman, the only furniture not covered in paint. He stared at what Liam had created, what Ruth had helped him create. This wasn't mess. This was art. This was grief transformed into something beautiful. What had he done? Liam's door was still closed. David walked down the hallway and knocked softly. "Buddy, can I come in?" Silence, then a small broken voice. "Is Ruth gone?" David closed his eyes. His throat felt tight. "Yes. She's gone." A sob came from inside the room. "You sent her away, just like you send everyone away. I hate you." The words hit David like physical blows. He leaned his forehead against the door. "Liam, I'm sorry. I was angry about work, and I came home and saw the mess and I reacted badly." "You're always angry," Liam shouted through the door. "You're always working. Ruth was nice to me. She listened to me. She helped me remember Mommy without feeling sad. And you sent her away because you don't want me to be happy. That's not true, David started, but even as he said it, he wondered if it was. Had he sabotaged his son's happiness because he couldn't stand seeing someone else succeed where he'd failed? Go away, Liam said. Just go away. David stood outside his son's door for 5 more minutes, but Liam wouldn't respond to anything else he said. Finally, he walked back to the living room. The paint was already starting to dry. Tomorrow, he'd call a cleaning service. Tonight, he just needed to think. He poured himself that whiskey he'd wanted earlier and sat on the paint-free ottoman, staring at his wife's portrait painted in his son's handprints. In Ruth's voice, he heard the echo of his own mother's words about standards and appropriate people, and knowing one's place, and he realized with sick certainty that he'd let those poisonous thoughts influence his actions. He'd fired Ruth not because she was negligent, but because she was different from what he expected, because his mother's prejudices had infected his thinking, because seeing his son happy with someone else made him feel inadequate, because walking in on that scene with Thomas there had embarrassed him. All wrong reasons. Terrible reasons. And now Ruth was gone. Liam hated him, and David was alone with his anger and his expensive paint-covered furniture. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. Hey man, hope everything works out with your son. That nanny seemed really good with him though. Just saying. David threw his phone on the couch. He didn't want to hear it. He'd made his decision. He'd find a new nanny tomorrow. Someone who followed rules. Someone who kept things orderly. Someone who wouldn't make him question everything about himself. He sat there until midnight, drinking whiskey and staring at the painting his son had made. The painting that was a mother's face. The painting that was a cry for help. The painting that was love made visible. And he finally admitted to himself what he'd really seen when he walked through that door. Not chaos, not negligence, but joy, connection, healing. Everything he'd failed to give his son for 2 years. Ruth had provided in 3 months, and he'd destroyed it in 5 minutes of anger and pride and fear. David woke up on the ottoman at 4 a.m, his neck stiff and his head pounding from too much whiskey and too little sleep. The living room still smelled like finger paint. In the dim light from the city outside, Jennifer's portrait looked ghostly on the white sofa. He couldn't bring himself to clean it yet. He checked on Liam before heading to his own room. His son had finally fallen asleep, still in his paint-covered clothes, tear tracks dried on his cheeks. David pulled a blanket over him and stood there watching him breathe. When had his boy gotten so big? When had he stopped being a toddler and become this small person with real feelings and real pain? The next morning was Friday. David called his office and told them he'd be working from home. Then he called the elite staffing agency. Patricia Monroe sounded surprised to hear from him so soon. Is everything all right with Ruth? She's no longer with us, David said stiffly. I need a replacement immediately. There was a pause on the line. May I ask what happened? Ruth has been with our agency for 15 years. We've never had a complaint about her. It didn't work out, David said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Can you send someone today? Patricia sighed. I can have someone there by Monday. Mrs. Helen Pemberton. She's very experienced. Very structured. I think she'll be more what you're looking for. Perfect. David hung up and went to face his son. Liam refused to come out of his room. He wouldn't eat breakfast. Wouldn't speak to David except to ask if Ruth was coming back. When David said no, Liam threw a toy truck against the wall and screamed that he hated his father. Then he locked himself in his room again. David stood helplessly outside the door, having no idea what to do. Finally, he called his housekeeper and asked her to come early. Maybe a woman's presence would help. When she arrived and saw the painted sofa, her eyes went wide. Where is Ruth? I let her go, David said shortly. Can you try to get Liam to eat something? The housekeeper looked at him with something close to anger. That woman loved your boy like he was her own grandson. She did her best, shaking her head and muttering in Spanish as she headed toward Liam's room. The weekend was a nightmare. Liam barely ate. He cried constantly. He asked for Ruth every hour. David tried everything. He promised new toys, offered ice cream, suggested they go to the park. Nothing worked. His son looked at him like he was a stranger who had taken away the one person who made him feel safe. By Sunday evening, David was desperate enough to try calling Ruth. She didn't answer. He left a message that went unreturned. He texted an apology that showed as read but received no response. What had he expected? That she'd forgive him instantly? That she'd come running back after the way he'd spoken to her? Monday morning, Mrs. Pemberton arrived. She was in her mid-60s, rail-thin, with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a crisp gray dress and sensible shoes. Her handshake was firm and brief. She looked around the apartment with approval, though David noticed her slight frown when she saw the still-painted sofa. He'd covered it with a sheet, unable to bring himself to clean it yet. She's very qualified, Patricia had assured him. Former governess to European families. Very proper. Very professional. Mrs. Pemberton reviewed David's schedule for Liam with a series of nods. Yes, structure is essential for children. They need boundaries and routine. The previous nanny sounds like she was far too permissive. David wanted to defend Ruth but didn't know how without admitting he'd been wrong to fire her. So he just showed Mrs. Pemberton to her room and left for the office, relieved to escape. That evening when he came home, the apartment was spotless. The toys were put away. The books were organized by size on the shelf. Even the covered sofa had been professionally cleaned. The painting was gone. David felt something twist in his chest. That was Liam's art, his expression of grief, and now it was erased like it had never existed. Liam sat at the dinner table, eating in complete silence. Mrs. Pemberton had prepared a healthy meal with precise portions. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong. How was your day, buddy? David tried. Liam didn't answer. He just pushed food around his plate with his fork, his eyes down. Children should be seen and not heard during meals, Mrs. Pemberton said pleasantly. It aids digestion and teaches proper manners. David opened his mouth to say that he wanted to hear from his son, but Liam had already gotten up and asked to be excused. Mrs. Pemberton nodded permission, and the boy disappeared to his room. The week went downhill from there. Every day Liam became more withdrawn. He stopped speaking almost entirely. The brief smiles and small laughs that Ruth had coaxed out of him vanished. He moved through the apartment like a shadow, avoiding both David and Mrs. Pemberton. By Friday, David got a call from Liam's school. His son's teacher, Ms. Chen, asked if she could schedule a meeting. There were concerns about Liam's behavior. He'd been sitting alone at recess. He'd stopped participating in class. He'd started crying for no apparent reason during story time. David met with her the next morning. Ms. Chen was a kind woman in her 30s who had taught Liam since kindergarten. She sat across from David with a worried expression. Mr. Richardson, I'm very concerned about Liam. He'd been doing so much better this past few months. He was starting to engage again, to smile, to play with other children. But this past week, it's like he's regressed back to how he was right after his mother passed. Actually, he seems worse. David felt sick. There was a change at home, he admitted. We have a new nanny, Miss Chen nodded slowly. The previous nanny, Ruth, she stayed in touch with me. I hope that's all right. She would update me on Liam's progress at home, and I would share what I noticed at school. We worked together to support him. She was wonderful. Of course she had stayed in touch with the teacher. Of course she had coordinated Liam's care across all areas of his life. Because that's what a professional did. That's what someone who truly cared did. Why did she leave? Miss Chen asked carefully. I fired her, David said. The words tasted like ash. I came home to a mess and reacted badly. Ms. Chen's face showed surprise, then understanding, then disappointment. She tried to hide it, but David saw it anyway. He was getting used to seeing that expression. Everyone who knew about Ruth's firing wore it. The nightmares came back that weekend. Liam woke up screaming Saturday night, calling for his mother, then for Ruth. David rushed to his room, but Liam wouldn't let him close. He backed away, pressed against the headboard, eyes wide with fear. David had never felt more helpless in his life. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway in her robe. Perhaps it's best if I handle this. Children sometimes do better with consistent caregivers. But David was his father. He should be the one comforting his son. Except his son didn't want his comfort. Didn't trust him. Didn't want him. He stepped back and let Mrs. Pemberton deal with it. She got Liam calmed down with efficiency but no warmth. No hugs, no soothing words, just practical instructions to breathe deeply and lie back down. It worked, but it felt hollow. David's sister called on Sunday. Rebecca lived in Boston with her husband and 2 kids. She and David had never been particularly close, but she'd stayed in touch more since Jennifer died. Checking on them, she said. Making sure they were okay. "How's my nephew doing?" she asked. "He's fine," David lied. A pause. "I heard you fired Ruth." David closed his eyes. "How did you know about that?" "She calls me every week," Rebecca said quietly. "Has been since she started working for you." We became friends. She'd update me on how Liam was doing because she knew I worried about him from so far away. Another thing David hadn't known. Another person Ruth had connected with to ensure Liam had a support network. Another way she'd gone above and beyond her job description. "Why did you fire her, David?" Rebecca's voice was hard now. "And don't give me some excuse about mess or professionalism. I want the real reason." David found himself telling his sister everything. The failed Tokyo deal, coming home to the paint, his anger and embarrassment, the things he'd said, the implications in his words that he hadn't quite meant but couldn't take back. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Do you know what Ruth told me about that day?" Rebecca finally said. "She told me it was the first time in 2 years that Liam had voluntarily talked about Jennifer. He'd asked Ruth if she thought his mom could see him from heaven. And Ruth said yes, she thought moms always watched over their children. And Liam said he wanted to paint a picture big enough that his mom could see it from really far away. Big enough that she'd know he still loved her and missed her every day." David felt tears burning his eyes. He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, trying to hold them back. "Ruth worked with him for 3 hours on that painting," Rebecca continued. "She let him use his whole body because that's what he wanted, to put himself into it, to feel connected to his mom through the act of creation. And you walked in and saw mess instead of love. You saw chaos instead of healing. And worse than that, David, you saw a black woman sitting on your floor with your son and you let mom's poison into your head." David wanted to deny it, wanted to say that wasn't what happened. But it was. Some part of him had looked at that scene and seen exactly what his mother had warned him about. Someone forgetting their place. Someone getting too comfortable. Someone who didn't belong in their world. All of it racist, all of it wrong, all of it coming from his own unchallenged biases. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did. So what are you going to do about it?" Rebecca demanded. "Because right now you've traumatized your son again. Fired the best thing that's happened to him in 2 years. And I swear, David, if you don't fix this, I will never forgive you." She hung up on him. David sat with his phone in his hand, staring at nothing. Around him, his perfect apartment felt like a prison. Everything in its place. Everything spotless and organized and lifeless. Just like his relationship with his son. Just like his heart. Monday brought another call from school. Liam's therapist, Dr. Patricia Wong, whom he'd been seeing since Jennifer's death, requested an urgent meeting. David rearranged his entire afternoon to see her. Dr. Wong was a small woman with kind eyes and a direct manner. She'd been patient with David's sporadic attendance at family sessions, understanding that grief made people avoid difficult conversations. But today her expression was serious. "Mr. Richardson, I need to be frank with you. Liam has regressed significantly in the past 2 weeks. He's barely speaking in our sessions. His anxiety levels are through the roof. His depression markers are worse than they've been since immediately after his mother's death." "What changed?" David explained about Ruth's firing, his voice flat. As he talked, he watched Dr. Wong's face cycle through surprise, concern, and what looked like frustration. "Did you know that Ruth was in regular contact with me?" Dr. Wong asked when he finished. "No," David admitted, "but I'm learning that Ruth was in contact with everyone involved in Liam's care. Because that's what good therapeutic support looks like," Dr. Wong said. "Ruth wasn't just a nanny, Mr. Richardson. She was part of a coordinated team helping your son heal from profound trauma. She attended 2 of our sessions. She implemented strategies we discussed. She was a partner in Liam's treatment." David felt the weight of his mistake growing heavier. "How bad is he?" Dr. Wong pulled out a folder. She showed him drawings Liam had done in their last session. Dark scribbles. A house with no people. A boy alone in a corner. He's telling me he feels abandoned. First his mother died. Now Ruth is gone. And he's terrified you'll leave too, or that he'll lose anyone else he loves. So he's shutting down completely. What do I do?" David asked. His voice cracked. "How do I fix this?" "You need to address the root cause," Dr. Wong said. "Liam needs Ruth back, or at the very least he needs closure with her. A chance to say goodbye properly, to understand why she left. And you need to be honest with him. Children aren't stupid, Mr. Richardson. They know when adults are lying to them." David went home that evening feeling like he'd been hollowed out. Mrs. Pemberton reported that Liam had eaten approximately 60% of his dinner and completed his homework with minimal resistance. She said it like it was good news. David wanted to scream. His son wasn't a performance metric. He was a broken-hearted little boy who needed help his father didn't know how to give. That night, David did something he hadn't done in months. He went into Liam's room after the boy fell asleep and just sat there watching him. His son looked so small in his bed, so vulnerable. His face was relaxed in sleep, but there were still tear stains on his pillow. "I'm sorry," David whispered. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm going to try." He knew what he needed to do. He needed to find Ruth. He needed to apologize properly, not through a text or voicemail, but face to face. He needed to beg her to come back, and if she wouldn't, he at least needed to give Liam the chance to see her again, to say goodbye, to understand that her leaving wasn't his fault. But when David called the staffing agency the next morning, Patricia delivered devastating news. Ruth's file showed a forwarding address in Georgia. She'd left New York entirely, gone home to care for her mother, who was ill. And no, Patricia wouldn't give him Ruth's new address or phone number. Privacy policies, she said, though David heard the judgment in her voice. The implication that he'd lost the right to contact Ruth when he'd fired her the way he did. David hung up and put his head in his hands. He'd driven Ruth away completely, and now Liam was suffering because of his pride, his anger, and his inability to see past his own prejudices. He looked up at the ceiling of his office, at the lights that cost a fortune in the building his company owned, surrounded by all the markers of his success, and none of it mattered. None of it meant anything, because he'd failed at the only thing that was truly important, being a good father, being a good person, and he had no idea how to make it right. David spent the next 3 days trying to track down Ruth through every means he could think of. He called the references on her resume, but they politely declined to share her current contact information. He tried social media, but Ruth had no online presence he could find. He even considered hiring a private investigator, but something about that felt like another violation of her privacy. Another way of treating her as less than human. Meanwhile, Liam got worse. He stopped eating almost entirely. Mrs. Pemberton reported with clinical detachment that the child was consuming approximately 40% of recommended calories. David wanted to fire her too, but what good would that do? Liam had already lost one caregiver. Losing another might destroy him completely. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Wong's office called to request David come in immediately. Without Liam, just David. He left work at 2, his stomach churning with anxiety. What had happened now? Had Liam done something at school? Said something concerning in therapy? Dr. Wong met him in her office, and this time she wasn't alone. A woman sat in the other chair. It took David a moment to recognize Ruth. She looked tired, older than she had 2 weeks ago. She wore a simple dress and carried a worn purse. When she saw David, her expression remained neutral, but he saw her hands tighten around the purse strap. "Please sit down, Mr. Richardson," Dr. Wong said. "We have a lot to discuss." David sat slowly, his eyes never leaving Ruth. "What's going on?" Dr. Wong folded her hands on her desk. "Ruth contacted me this morning. She's been worried about Liam since she left. I've kept her updated on his condition because she was part of his treatment team. When I told her how severe his regression has become, she decided to come back to New York. Not to return to your employment, she made that very clear, but to ensure Liam gets what he needs." David looked at Ruth. "You came back for him?" Ruth met his eyes. "That child has been through enough pain, Mr. Richardson. What happened between you and me doesn't matter. What matters is helping him heal." Dr. Wong cleared her throat. "But before we discuss how to help Liam going forward, there's something you need to understand, Mr. Richardson. Something I should have shared with you months ago, but I was bound by a confidence. However, given the current crisis, I've been released from that obligation." Ruth agreed I should show you this. She pulled out a sealed envelope from her desk drawer. David's name was written on it in handwriting he recognized instantly. Jennifer's handwriting. His heart started pounding. "Your wife gave this to me 6 months before she died," Dr. Wong said quietly. "She made me promise to only open it under specific circumstances. One of those circumstances was if you ever fired the nanny she'd arranged for Liam." David's voice came out hoarse. "Jennifer arranged for Ruth?" Dr. Wong nodded. She opened the envelope and pulled out several pages. Your wife spent the last months of her life planning for how to help Liam cope after she was gone. She researched grief counseling for children. She interviewed potential therapists. She talked to pediatric psychologists. And she searched for a nanny who specialized in helping children process loss. She found me through a grief counseling network, Ruth said softly. Your wife contacted me 9 months before she passed. We met several times. She told me everything about Liam, what he loved, what scared him, how he expressed emotions. She wanted to make sure that when she was gone, he'd have someone who understood how to help him through it. David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. All this time, he'd thought hiring Ruth was his decision, his choice. But Jennifer had orchestrated it from beyond the grave, planning for their son's care even while she was dying. Dr. Wong began reading from Jennifer's letter. Her voice was gentle but clear. David, if you're hearing this, it means something has gone wrong with Ruth's employment. I know you, my love. I know how you handle grief. You'll try to control everything. You'll want order and structure and perfection because those things make you feel safe. But our son can't heal that way. The words hit David like physical blows. Jennifer had known him so well, had predicted exactly how he'd react to her death. You need to let Liam be messy, Jennifer's letter continued. You need to let him express his feelings, even the ugly ones, especially the ugly ones. Children don't process grief the way adults do. They need to play, to create, to make messes, to laugh, to cry, to be angry. Ruth knows how to help him do that. Please, David, trust her. Trust the process. Let our son be a child, not a little adult trying to hold everything together. Dr. Wong paused, then continued. I know your mother will have opinions about Ruth, about her background, about whether she's appropriate for our family. Don't listen to her, David. I chose Ruth because she's exactly what Liam needs. She's warm, she's patient, and she knows how to help children heal from loss because she's experienced it herself. When she was young, she lost her own son to illness. She understands grief in a way most people don't. David's head snapped toward Ruth. You lost a child? Ruth's eyes were wet. 35 years ago. My boy was 8 years old. Leukemia. That's why I dedicated my life to caring for other people's children, because I couldn't save my own. The pieces started falling into place. Ruth's infinite patience with Liam, her understanding of grief, her ability to let him express emotions without judgment. She'd lived through every parent's worst nightmare, and she'd turned that pain into purpose. Dr. Wong kept reading. If Liam is making messes, it means he's expressing himself. If he's painting, creating, playing loudly, that's good. That's healing. The worst thing would be silence, withdrawal, shutting down. That's when you need to worry, David. Not when things are messy, but when they're too quiet. David remembered the silent apartment with Mrs. Pemberton, the spotless rooms, Liam moving like a ghost, everything too quiet. Everything wrong. The letter went on. I need you to promise me something, David. Promise that you'll let Liam grieve in his own way. Promise that you'll support him even when it's messy and uncomfortable. Promise that you'll address your own grief instead of burying it in work. And promise that you'll examine the prejudices your mother taught you. I love you, but I know those ugly thoughts are in there. Don't let them hurt our son or push away the people who care about him. Jennifer had seen everything. All his flaws, all his weaknesses, and she'd loved him anyway while also trying to protect their son from his worst impulses. Finally, Jennifer's letter addressed the specific scenario. If you're reading this because David fired Ruth, please tell him what really happened the day he came home to the painted living room. Tell him about our plan. Tell him everything. Dr. Wong looked up. The painting wasn't spontaneous, Mr. Richardson. It was carefully planned. Ruth had been working with me for weeks preparing for that specific activity. We knew it would be messy. We knew you'd probably have a strong reaction. But Liam had been stuck in his grief, unable to move forward, and we needed to help him break through. Ruth picked up the explanation. Your wife left detailed instructions about when I should do this activity with Liam. It was supposed to happen when you were in Tokyo, so he'd have time to process it before showing you the final result. But when the trip got cut short and you came home early, we were right in the middle of it. The painting was the breakthrough we'd been working toward for 3 months, Dr. Wong added. Liam had never been able to talk about Jennifer without shutting down completely. But that day, for the first time, he wanted to create something in her memory. He wanted to express his love for her in a physical, visible way. David's voice was barely a whisper, and I destroyed it. You did more than that, Ruth said quietly. You confirmed his deepest fear, that if he showed real emotions, if he made mistakes, if he wasn't perfect, the people he loved would leave him. First his mother died, which he couldn't control. Then you fired me because he made a mess. In his mind, his joy literally drove me away. David put his head in his hands. Oh God, what have I done? Dr. Wong gave him a moment, then continued. There's more. Ruth, do you want to share the rest? Ruth hesitated, then nodded. Your wife asked me to help you too, Mr. Richardson. She left me a separate letter with suggestions for how to encourage you to be more present with Liam, how to help you process your own grief. She knew you'd resist therapy. She knew you'd bury yourself in work, so she asked me to find small ways to bring you back to your son. The drawings on the fridge, David realized. The toys left where I'd see them. The books on the coffee table, Ruth nodded. I was trying to make Liam visible to you, to remind you he was there, living and growing and needing you, but you just cleaned up around him. Put everything back in its place, made him invisible again. The truth of it cut deeper than any accusation. David had been erasing his son from his own life, treating him like another thing to be managed and organized. No wonder Liam had shut down. Your wife also asked me to document Liam's progress, Ruth continued, to take photos and videos so that someday, when you were ready, you could see what you'd been missing. She knew grief would blind you for a while. She wanted you to be able to look back and see your son's childhood, even the parts you weren't present for. Do you still have them? David asked. The photos? Ruth pulled out her phone. Hundreds of photos. Liam laughing at the park. Liam reading a book. Liam making cookies in the kitchen. Liam at the museum, his face lit up with wonder. A whole documentation of his son's life that David had missed because he'd been too busy controlling things to actually experience them. Dr. Wong pulled out another document. Jennifer also left this with me. It's a therapy plan she created with a psychologist friend, specific steps for helping Liam through grief at different stages. Ruth has been following it perfectly. The painting activity was step 7. There are 13 steps total, designed to guide Liam through processing his loss in a healthy way. David looked at the detailed plan, pages of research and thought and love. His wife had spent her final months ensuring their son would be cared for, and David had thrown it all away in 5 minutes of anger. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why didn't you show me this from the beginning? Because Jennifer asked us not to, Dr. Wong said gently. She wanted you to trust Ruth naturally, to learn to let go of control without it being forced. She hoped you'd see Liam's progress and realize that mess and structure could coexist. That healing and order weren't opposites. She believed in you, Ruth added. She thought you'd come around eventually. Learn to be present. Let yourself grieve. But she also knew you might struggle. That's why she left the contingency plan with Dr. Wong. David looked at these 2 women who had conspired with his dead wife to save his son, who had worked tirelessly to help Liam while David had been too blind to see it. He thought about his harsh words to Ruth, his accusations, the bias underlying his anger, the way he'd dismissed her professionalism and dedication. I'm sorry, he said to Ruth. The words felt inadequate. I'm so deeply sorry, not just for firing you, but for the things I said, the implications in my words. I let my mother's prejudice infect my thinking. I saw you and Liam happy together, and instead of being grateful, I felt threatened. And I blamed you for my own inadequacy as a father. Ruth's expression softened slightly. Your wife told me you'd probably react badly at some point. She said you'd push back hard before you could move forward. I just wish it hadn't hurt Liam so much. Can you ever forgive me? David asked.